In this episode of Idea City.
So essentially, when you're marrying your daughter, you cannot afford the entire payment at the time of marriage. So what happens is she enters into her new household, and she'll be tortured by her in-laws to obtain the owed money from her parents from the marriage arrangement. And they typically do this using fire, and then they can report to the authorities she accidentally hurt herself in a kitchen fire. Now, this is a phenomenon people know about in India. It's written about. It's written about in the media. But if it's true that these numbers are true, 100,000, this would put these numbers up much higher than anyone had thought before.
This is a CFAR periodical that they put out with some of their ongoing research, and it poses the question, where have all the women gone? Siwan, are you here? Come on up. Siwan's an economist who fell upon this really disturbing story, and I'm going to let her tell you, but we're going to begin with the disappearing female, and then we're going to segue to the even more disappearing male. I'll be right back. Siwan?
Thank you. Okay, so perhaps one of the starkest manifestations of gender discrimination is this phenomenon of missing women. And how you define missing women, it is essentially women and girls who should be alive but are not due to mistreatment or unequal treatment and neglect relative to men. The estimates, Amartya Sen, a Nobel laureate in economics, first coined this term missing women, and he put forth the first estimates of the numbers of women who are missing simply due to pure discrimination, and he came up with 100 million. And this was an alarming number, of course, and there's been a fair bit of research trying to explain why these women are missing. And the main regions that he focused on and where people have focused, where they have mainly existed, is in parts of Asia, particularly in China. Of those 100 million, 50 million are in China. And in India, 40 million are in India. So just to give you an idea of how this is actually computed and what motivated this estimate, is if you look in developed countries where we think, the gender discrimination goes on, but not to this degree, and you look at the total number of men and women in a given population, what you see is women outnumber men. And this is by contrast, if you look in regions such as India and China, what you see is men outnumber women. So essentially, the sex ratio, the overall sex ratio in a given population, suspiciously favors males in these parts of Asia. But this has been, so Sen put these estimates out in the early 90s, this has certainly been on the agenda of policymakers in both of these countries. Activists are very involved in this issue. And there's been a lot of laws imposed to curtail the phenomenon. So, for example, legally now women can also inherit property and own property. There's been anti-discrimination laws put into place. Prenatal sex determination, sex-selective abortion have been made illegal. The one-child policy has been relaxed in areas where the sex ratio is particularly biased in favor of boys. And so particularly if your first child is a girl, you're allowed to have a second child, hoping that you won't end the life of that girl. And then in the case of India, where they think the problem's been partly exacerbated by these dowry phenomena, where, again, this is a huge economic cost to having a daughter, and these payments have been rising, spreading, and inflating through time, and so that could be exacerbating the problem in India, they've been made illegal. But essentially, there's been no decline in the missing women. So, possibly these laws have not worked. Certainly, it's very hard to enforce most of these laws in these regions. In practice, women can own property but legally they can own property, and in practice they seldom actually inherit the property. And aside from the just extreme representation of gender discrimination, these gender imbalances actually have much farther-reaching consequences. In particular, there's a recent estimate that more than 25 million men in China can no longer find brides. There's simply no women in that demographic of marrying age available. They're just not there. India has not reached this stage yet, but the projections are similar for the next over the next 3 decades. And so this is just to show you, so this axis here is now the total number of men versus women in India, and this is year along this axis. This is essentially covering a century. So you see that as this graph increases, it means the number of men compared to women is increasing. So if anything, it's just been increasing over a century. So there's been no abatement in the phenomenon. So then you have to ask the question, why are they still disappearing? For 20 years, we've been researching this. For 20 years, policymakers have been involved. And as mentioned, certainly the laws are not enforced. And this is particularly true for the anti-abortion laws, the ultrasound laws, the dowry laws, and so forth. But it's also possible this prenatal explanation is not the entire story. So that's been the entire focus of research in the literature for 20 years. Possibly that's not the whole story. And this is exactly where my research comes in. I'm trying to dig deeper to see if that's the sole explanation. And to address this question, why are they still missing?
When we come back,
it's a much more universal phenomenon than previously thought. So they're not just in Asia, as everyone has thought. Actually, there are missing women in Sub-Saharan Africa. And there are 2 million missing women each year. And this is on the exact same scale as in both India and China. There's approximately 2 million each year there.
Get the latest Idealist news, presenter information, and watch streaming video at www.ideacityonline.com. Idea City, the smartest people, the biggest ideas.
So what I do is I step back and go back to those 100 million missing women and decompose them by age. So I'm going to figure out, at what age are they actually missing? And this will address the question, are they really all at birth, as everyone has been saying? And then I can also figure out at what is their main cause of death. So I'm going to be trying to figure out at what age are they missing and what are they dying from to inform this puzzle a bit more in detail. And from this, it's a relatively simple exercise, I get 2 key findings. So the first is that it's a much more universal phenomenon than previously thought. So they're not just in Asia, as everyone has thought. Actually, there are missing women in Sub-Saharan Africa. And there are 2 million missing women each year. And this is on the exact same scale as in both India and China. There's approximately 2 million each year there. And because the population in Sub-Saharan Africa is smaller, actually as a proportion of the female population, it's even higher in Sub-Saharan Africa. And this very much goes against the previous assumptions where people assume that there are no missing women in Sub-Saharan Africa, therefore women are treated much better in that region of the world. And the reason that this came about is because, in fact, everyone was focusing on these sex ratios at birth and the biases at birth, and in African ethnicities, actually for genetic reasons, favor girls, have more girls relative to boys than anyone else in the world. So this was actually overlooked, and when you take this into account, you do find missing women in Sub-Saharan Africa. So the number of missing women has long been underestimated. And secondly, the majority of missing women are not at birth, as everyone has thought. So in other words, this prenatal sex selection story, the simple cultural explanation of the phenomenon, does not explain the 100 million missing women. In fact, the majority of missing women die as adults, so greater than 15 years old, when people start to marry in these regions of the world. So 55% of the missing women in China, so of that total 50 million, are actually dying at ages over 15. 66% in India, and 83% in Sub-Saharan Africa. So this is actually a graph to show you where the percentage of missing women are. Oops. Okay, so on this axis, the vertical axis, what we have is the percentage of missing women. And then on this axis, we have age. And this line is for India. So what this is telling you is at age 0, so the prenatal stage, only 11% is explained. So only 11% of women are at the prenatal stage. So if this was as we should have expected before, we should expect this to be at 100. So it's not at all. And then you see a similar percentage at this childhood ages, which is 0 to 4. And then we're going to see a huge chunk of missing women at the reproductive ages. And then a big majority actually at older than 45. So this is very much contrary to how people were thinking about the phenomenon. And then this is the case for Sub-Saharan Africa, so there are none at birth. So I mean, it's still the prenatal story still holds for India, and it will do so even more for China, but it's not the whole story. So we see none for Sub-Saharan Africa at birth. We see similar numbers in the early childhood, huge number at the reproductive ages, and again at the older ages. And then China looks very different. So as much as 45% of that 50 million are at the prenatal stage there, and then far fewer at the younger ages, and then again a big chunk at the older ages. So if the earlier focus of the research in this area has been all this, and you can see how there's huge variation, and it's not the whole story. So this is a distribution by age. Now I'm going to tell you, so there, you can see that the majority are actually dying after birth, so I'm going to now tell you what are they prematurely dying from. So in that category of early childhood diseases, in the early childhood ages for Sub-Saharan Africa and India, there you see 300,000 missing girls. So again, boys are dying as well at these age groups, but this is in excess of boys, and this is in excess of what we should expect a natural rate from these diseases without discrimination. Okay, so this is how you think about it. So 300,000 each year in Sub-Saharan Africa and India before the age of 4. And what they're dying from is what we think of as preventable diseases, meaning diseases we no longer die from in the developed world. So these are diarrhea-related diseases, which are related to sanitation issues, vaccine-preventable diseases, and then in Sub-Saharan Africa, where malaria is a huge problem, 150,000 missing girls each year from malaria in Sub-Saharan Africa. So what my research can do at this point is tell you what they're dying from. The next questions is we have to figure out what part of this is discrimination. So we know there's a lot of discrimination that goes on in the household. So for example, families that are poverty or income restricted, they often give the nutrients to the boys, not the girls. They educate the boys, not the girls. There's even recent work that the women breastfeed the boys and not the girls. But we need to figure out, is it the case that parents are giving the clean water to the boys and not to the girls? And that's why we're seeing this excess female mortality from these diarrhea-related diseases. Is it possible they're not vaccinating the girls, but they are the boys? Are they using the mosquito nets to prevent malaria for the boys and not the girls? And these are questions we need to dig deeper into.
When we come back.
Instead, they exist in all parts of the developing world. It's a much more universal phenomenon where there's definitely varying cultural norms. It's not a simple cultural explanation. There's no way you can say the cultural norms in India are the same as they are in Sub-Saharan Africa. Instead, each region's story is different, but what's likely the case is discrimination is playing a role at all stages of women's lives.
Great ideas are meant to be shared. Join the discussion on Facebook. Idea City, the smartest people, the biggest ideas.
Turning to the big chunk of missing women at the reproductive ages. So maternal deaths, so dying at childbirth, explains 15% of the missing women in Sub-Saharan Africa and in India. So in Sub-Saharan Africa, your risk of dying at childbirth for a woman through her lifetime is 1 in 20, so it's huge still. Hemorrhage is a leading cause of death. This is, the bulk of them happen in the rural areas. There's essentially no skilled birth attendant present. And the risk is higher with genital mutilation, another violation against women that goes on in this part of the world. For India and for China, you see 100,000 missing women each year at these reproductive ages from so-called injuries. And in India, it's from fire-related deaths. And this is the only place in the world where you see this excess female mortality from fires. And we can't prove this. All we know is that it's fires. But my suspicion is it's linked to that dowry phenomenon that I spoke about before. So again, these dowry demands, so this is the payment the parents have to make to marry off their daughter. And everyone marries, in general. Everyone has to pay a dowry. I mean, it was made illegal, but it's had absolutely almost no impact. And these dowry demands are massive. They're certainly higher than your annual income, a household annual income. They can be as high as 6 times estimates show. So essentially, when you're marrying your daughter, you cannot afford the entire payment at the time of marriage. So what happens is she enters into her new household, and she'll be tortured by her in-laws to obtain the owed money from her parents from the marriage arrangement. And they typically do this using fire, and then they can report to the authorities she accidentally hurt herself in a kitchen fire. Now, this is a phenomenon people know about in India. It's written about. It's written about in the media. But if it's true that these numbers are true, 100,000, this would put these numbers up much higher than anyone had thought before. In China, you similarly see 100,000 missing women from injury. In this case, it's suicide. So China is the only country in the world where women are more likely to commit suicide than men. So everywhere else, men are more likely to commit suicide than women. So 100,000 missing women. So again, men are also committing suicide, but this is in excess of what we should expect, the excess female mortality from suicide. And just to give you an example of how much this is happening, every 4 minutes, one woman in China kills herself. And this is the majority, this goes on in urban areas. There's excess female mortality from suicide in urban areas, but it's much more in the rural areas. And typically, these women ingest the agricultural pesticide to end their lives. Now, there's this massive chunk of missing women in Sub-Saharan Africa at the reproductive ages. Partly it was that childbirth, but the biggest reason is HIV/AIDS. So there's 600,000 excess female deaths from HIV/AIDS every year in Sub-Saharan Africa. And this is the only place in the world where women are more likely to die from HIV/AIDS than men. And this isn't just relative to the developed world, where we know people die from AIDS in the developed world for very different reasons than they might, or contract HIV/AIDS differently than they do in the developing world. This is also relative to all other developing regions. So this is a very startling or alarming number. So the young adult population, women comprise 75% of the young adult population living with HIV in that area. So again, we have to figure out what is gender discrimination in these numbers. We know there's a huge amount of sexual violence against women in this part of the world. We know they have very limited ability to negotiate for safer sex practices. There are also social norms that allow for concurrent sexual partners, particularly for men. And also there's emerging research showing that there's unequal access by gender to the new antiretroviral treatment that's gradually becoming available in this part of the world. So we have to try and understand the role of discrimination. And then finally, 40% of the missing women in China and India are actually older than 45. And once you reach older than 45 in the developing world, you're going to die from diseases that we die from in the developed world. So this will be dying from something like cardiovascular disease. And again, this is relative to the developed world where where we think there's at least gender discrimination in terms of medical care and so forth. So in the developed world, men are twice as likely than women to die from heart disease. If you contrast this with China and India, what you see is men and women die at the same rate. So when you're doing that computing that excess female mortality, essentially you see significant excess female mortality in China and India from heart disease. So again, we have to try and understand the role of discrimination. It's quite conceivable that men are given medical treatment and women are not at these older ages. For example, widows are very much the poorest of the poor in India. They're shunned from societies, ostracized from their families. And this is no small problem. There's an estimated 40 million widows in India. So this could be a big role. So anyway, the bottom line is that it's not a simple cultural explanation, as people thought of explaining this sex selection at the prenatal stage. It's not the case that 100 million are missing due to these sex-selective abortion. Instead, they exist in all parts of the developing world. It's a much more universal phenomenon where there's definitely varying cultural norms. It's not a simple cultural explanation. There's no way you can say the cultural norms in India are the same as they are in Sub-Saharan Africa. Instead, each region's story is different, but what's likely the case is discrimination is playing a role at all stages of women's lives, and it's not just at the early stages. Okay, thank you very much.
Siwan, thank you.
Thank you.
That's beautifully timed.
Thank you.
Well done.
If you look to historical data of developed countries today, they similarly had a lot of these missing women, and somehow we've got rid of the problem, either through various forms, even possibly economic development on its own affects the problem.